Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History. We're beginning episode 119. Yesterday, we laid the groundwork for this little mini series, this post-World War II era, and we talked about Operation Sunrise. And there were two takeaways I really wanted to emphasize in that episode 118. And the first one was the crossover from the private sector into the public sector of this philosophy, this corporate philosophy we know as Ultra Vires. Ultra Vires is the mandate for CEOs and board of directors of big corporations to only focus on one thing, and that is to maximize profits. Public interest was not to be taken into any consideration when making decisions about anything related to the corporation. It was all about maximizing profits. Didn't matter what the public interest was. It didn't matter what moral implications might be, ethical considerations, what's right, what's wrong. None of that mattered. It was just about maximizing profits. As long as this was strictly in the private sector, people could make an argument this was just the bad or ugly side of capitalism. When it really became dangerous is when it became integrated into the public sector, into our government. This happened about the World War I, World War II era, when because of the Great Depression and the crises that was faced by the United States government in handling the collapse of the stock market and farm prices, et cetera, FDR brought in the best and brightest private sector minds into his administration to help fix these problems because government minds weren't, it makes sense. You go out and get the best and the brightest. And a lot of them came from the private sector, and they brought this ultra vires mindset with them, maximizing profits. Public interest be damned. Now, that's the first part of it. The second part of it is immunizing yourself from any liability. Corporations were very, very good at writing the rules and making sure that those decisions were covered by immunity, so that if later there was some blowback or some kind of consequences, they would not fall on the corporation or the CEO or the board of directors. After all, as long as they were after maximizing profits, that was their number one, number two, number three, number four, number five objective. That's all that mattered. So there's the two parts of ultra vires that made it and integrated themselves into the public sector. And we're starting to see that in the wind down of World War II, where to not necessarily maximize profits, although he is working for the profits of the companies he's representing as a lawyer for Sullivan and Cromwell. He's also working for what he thinks is the intelligence bonanza, the maximum benefit he could reap for the intelligence of the United States going forward by recruiting into the service of what would later be called the CIA, former Nazis. And we learned that Alan Dulles was involved in that. We also learned that James Angleton was involved in that. In other words, they weren't, it didn't matter what the moral implications were. The fact that these were former Nazis, the fact that these guys were involved in the final solution, the fact that these guys were involved in genocide, none of that mattered. It's whatever intelligence bonanza or currency they bring to the equation. And it was justified by this idea that, hey, we need them in the fight, the struggle going forward against the Soviets. So you see Alan Dulles practicing and James Angleton in the public sector practicing this ultra vires mindset. And of course, if you go back and you rewatch the episodes that I did on the power elites and how they immunize themselves, when you are in charge, you can write the rules so that later nothing ever comes back to bite you. And so ultra vires, that whole mindset made it into the public sector, and Operation Sunrise was a perfect example of that. Today we're going to be talking, today and the next few episodes, we're going to be talking about Operation Paperclip, where this ultra vires mindset spreads. It's not just Alan Dulles and James Angleton, the intelligence apparatus. It's the entire United States government. And they're all making these trade-off decisions. They're laying aside whatever the public interest may be. They're laying aside whatever moral implications or ethical considerations or what's right or what's wrong. They're laying all that aside, and they're doing what's in the short-term best interest of the United States. Maybe it might be science, maybe it might be medicine, it might be intelligence, it might be technology, it might be industry. In whatever field, we are raiding the kitchen of the former Nazis. You know, all the haberdashery of all these former Nazis that have committed all these war crimes and should be punished for these war crimes after World War II. Instead, they're going to find employment, gainful employment in the United States, because they have a skill, they have a talent, they have an ability that we need. They have something of value, and so we're going to sort of look the other way, hold our nose, and bring these former Nazis back to the United States and enlist them in the struggle against the Soviets going forward. Of course, the Soviets are doing the same thing on their end. So that's part of our justification. Hey, if we don't do it, they'll take them all, and we'll be left behind. So that's where we're headed. That was the first takeaway I wanted you to remember or to learn from this period in history, Ultra Vires. And of course, I think it's important, especially because it explains so much of the history since World War One. So many of the big events. You think about some of the big decisions, or the tragedies, or even the assassinations. We talked at length about JFK and the assassination. I spent 104 episodes talking about that assassination, and all the different conspirators that were involved in this, all making the same decision. There was a benefit to them to make JFK go away. And they are all very keen on immunizing themselves so that after the crime was committed, no one pointed the finger at them. And they even went to the lengths to set up a patsy so that all the fault fell at the feet of a dupe. Somebody been set up by these conspirators to take the full brunt, to take the blame. So you see Ultra Vires in the JFK assassination, working to get rid of a problem to benefit maybe the CIA in this respect, the mob in that respect, LBJ in another respect, the Cubans in another respect, the Secret Service. They all had their areas, and I went through at length all the different benefits that came to them and all these different conspirators as a real result of one person being assassinated. And then they were all immunized. And it's a pretty intricate weave that was put together by LBJ and Alan Dulles and the CIA and the Secret Service. I mean, all these folks were involved in this cover-up, and poor hapless Lee Harvey Oswald didn't have a chance. You can apply Ultra Vires to the JFK assassination. You can apply Ultra Vires to the RFK assassination, to the MLK assassination. You can apply Ultra Vires to the Vietnam War. I mean, I don't know where to stop. Ultra Vires, if you understand that and how that integration of that, what used to be a private sector philosophy, capitalism gone rogue, once it integrated into the United States government, it explains everything. It explains what's going on right now in Ukraine. It explains everything that's going on right now with our election. If you've been following the news, it explains everything. We sometimes, I've been guilty of this, we hold our government to a higher standard and we say, well, they wouldn't do that because it's not what the public wants. We have to get past that and understand they don't care what the public wants. And then we ask the question, well, why is it none of these people get held to account for what they did? When we find out years later, because they immunized themselves. So they don't care about public interest. It's all about maximizing whatever benefit. It might be money, it might be power, it might be influence, there's a million different ways you can benefit. And so it's all about maximizing whatever benefit they see fit and then immunizing themselves. Once you understand that, you understand the true history and the current events that are happening around us. That was the first takeaway. The second takeaway was to understand that JFK is not the first president that Allen Dulles double-crossed. We saw it with FDR after Casablanca, who announced we would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. We would not make separate peace agreements secretly with any fascist, and we would hold all of them accountable at Nuremberg. Well, Allen Dulles, right off the bat, violated all three of those terms by himself, him and Angleton. They're just doing their own thing. So that's yesterday, and today we want to begin looking at Operation Paperclip, which is sort of the follow-up to Operation Sunrise. Now, I will stipulate, most people have heard of Operation Paperclip. Sunrise is a little bit more obscure, but today I want to kind of get into the backstory of Paperclip and bring us up to speed. And then the next two episodes, we'll go through a laundry list of former Nazis that we bring to the United States and some of the effects of that policy. All right, so let's start in 1932 with a German physicist named Albert Einstein, pictured here, pretty famous guy. He is ironically a Jew, and of course you know what's going on in Germany during these days, the lead up to World War II. The Nazi government is making it clear they're going to persecute Jews. If you were lucky, one of the lucky ones, and you had means, and you had something that maybe another country might find valuable, you might be able to flee Germany and be accepted by another country. Albert Einstein was one of the lucky ones. He got out in 1932. When he came to the United States, of course, he's a world-famous physicist, and he's bringing with him all this knowledge about what the Germans, because he'd been involved with the German physicist as well before 32, and he knew quite well what they had already discovered, because he was part of it. They had discovered nuclear fission, they were stockpiling uranium, and they were in preparation for a nuclear weapons program that they were set to begin in 1938. Okay, so this all takes a lot of prep work. There's a lot of discovery, a lot of testing, and a lot of experiments that have gone on. And Albert Einstein is fully aware of all of this. It's amazing. Hitler let him leave. This is one of those great ironies in history. Albert Einstein, who is going to be very instrumental in creating a nuclear program here in the United States, was once proper, could have been utilized by the German government, but because of their hatred for Jews, they chased him away. It's sort of what we call a brain drain. That great brain could have benefited the Germans and Hitler. They'd chosen to exploit him in that way, but instead they forced him out of the country, came to the United States, and he helped the other side instead. One of those great ironies. Einstein gets to the United States after he leaves, and he can't believe, as he looks around and he starts comparing the United States and what it knows about nuclear fission and what it's doing as far as creating a nuclear weapons program versus what he just came from in Germany. He can't believe the United States is so far behind. So he writes FDR a famous letter. There's a copy of it there. And he's warning FDR. He says, hey, Hitler and the Nazi government, they're working on developing a nuclear weapon. And I don't know, it seems like, this is probably going to end up in a war. I don't know that for sure yet, but I am predicting that at some point Hitler is going to invade other countries, and it could lead to another world war. And if they have a nuclear weapon, they have the ace in the whole weapon. They got the trump card to dominate the world. Unless you do something, you better do something to catch up. He couldn't believe the United States was so far behind. So he writes in this letter. And of course, FDR, as a result of that, creates the Manhattan Project. And so again, if it hadn't been for Einstein coming to the United States, And of course, he has great credibility, and he knows firsthand what the Germans have been involved in because he was part of it. So that letter couldn't have just come from anybody. It had to come from somebody of the stature of an Albert Einstein, whom was rejected because he was a Jew by the Germans, accepted by the Americans, and ended up being to our great benefit. Well, obviously, you know what happened. We end up uh, beating the Germans to the punch with this Manhattan Project. We used those two bombs in Japan and the war in Japan. Um, we didn't need it in Germany, but after Germany surrenders and we began searching Germany and going through it and looking to round up all the war criminals and searching for all its weaponry, et cetera, we discovered an underground nuclear lab with a test reactor hidden in a cave outside Heidelberg in 1945. So this is right after the Germans surrendered. So we're going over Germany with a fine-tooth comb, and we find this underground nuclear lab with a test reactor. It was hidden in a cave. 2 days later, the Americans discovered a textile factory that had been converted into another nuclear lab for German nuclear research. So this confirms what Einstein wrote in his letter. Not that we doubted it, but it confirms that the Germans were working on a nuclear weapon at the same time we were. We just beat them to the punch. We find the evidence. That's not all we found. We found a stockpile of German of uranium. And of course, Einstein had told the Americans that they were stockpiling uranium for a nuclear program that was set to begin in 1938. And they also had a heavy water supply. Heavy water is water with extra hydrogen, which is necessary for the manufacture of anything with nuclear technology. I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but evidently heavy water is something that is necessary. So it's got extra hydrogen in it. And in this location, we also found all of their research files. We captured 25 German scientists who were working at the lab, and we chased down a guy who was trying to flee, pictured here at the bottom right. His name is Werner Karl Heisenberg. He was a quantum physicist in charge of the labs. And of course, we kind of know who we're looking for because Einstein has told us, there isn't a physicist in Germany working in the nuclear program that Albert Einstein doesn't know. It's amazing to me Hitler let Einstein escape Germany the way he did. You just think about the knowledge that he could bring to the Americans, and then also the knowledge of who's working on what in Germany and what Germany is working on. I just can't believe he let Einstein leave. You talk about a huge mistake. I think that would be a really fascinating research topic is to find out what the circumstances were involved that allowed Einstein this, this genius with respect to physics, physics and this new technology, nuclear fission, and all the things related to that. And of course, the application of that, which is going to be really useful in a war, how they could let him leave and come to America, but they did. And it gave the Americans a heads up on what was happening in Germany so that they knew what to look for. They also found in Germany biological weapons. They found evidence that the Germans were working on weaponry that could be used against mass populations or against soldiers on the battlefield. The plague, typhoid, cholera, anthrax, malaria. The Germans had what they called ABC warfare. And the A stands for atomic, the B stands for biological, and the C stands for chemical. So they had, as we're discovering this after the war, and thankfully they didn't use very much of this against anybody, but they were close And some of this technology they had already perfected, or was at least usable by the time we get to the end of the war, but they hadn't used it, a lot of it. So we're thankful for that. But they were getting close to having the capacity to be able to use all this. And of course, we're going to find later that they also had V2 rockets, and no one else had these. These are unmanned flying rockets to which you could attach uh, this kind of weaponry, and you could shoot it at your enemy. And this is probably the biggest deterrent why they didn't use it. The V2 rockets were, they were just getting to the point where they'd mastered these V2 rockets when the war ended. Imagine if they'd had those rockets 2 years earlier and they could attack us with these atomic weapons or these biological weapons or these chemical weapons and not have to worry about firing them off in close proximity and then blowing back in the face of their own soldiers or their own communities. Rockets would free them from the consequences of their own weaponry. So this is pretty scary stuff we're talking about here. And this is what the Germans were working on. They were experimenting with these different delivery systems, which is what I was just discussing. Some of them they were fleas. Some of them were lice, mosquitoes, and they would use these fleas. They would infect and infect them with the plague, and then release all these fleas on their enemy, and the next thing you know, their enemy has the plague. Same thing with lice, mosquitoes. This was a more rudimentary delivery system. The V2 rocket would be the better alternative, but that they're still working on that. So the point is, the Germans are working on this ABC warfare the entire time the war is going on. Thankfully, one of their own came over to America and told us about the A so that we could catch up and build atomic weapons before they did. We had no idea about the B and the C until after the war was over and we discovered it. The C was, as I mentioned, the chemical, and that involved gases. Now, we had some knowledge of this because of what was going on in the concentration camps with the Zyklon B. This was the gas used to kill millions of Jews in the concentration camps. But there were other gases they were working on. Mustard gas was invented by the Germans. Tabun is just a tiny drop of tabun gas on a person's skin will kill him or her in seconds. And then sarin gas, the most lethal nerve agent, even more so than tabun. Nazis had manufactured 12,000 tons of this sarin gas by the end of the war. This is enough to kill millions of people. Now, again, this is not something that you can use a mosquito or a flea. You need these V2 rockets or some kind of rocket to be able to carry these capsules or to weaponize these rockets with these gases. And then you could wipe out New York City. You could wipe out Chicago. You could wipe out Washington, D.C. with a simple gas attack, a chemical weapon attack. Zyklon B, of course, they were using in the concentration camps, and LSD. These Nazi doctors, this is really important because this is going to be something that comes home to America, are using LSD in experiments against, and using a lot of these human patients, these victims in these concentration camps to perform these experiments on, to induce paranoia, cause hallucinations, and they're thinking about using this kind of a drug against enemies, where you could capture POWs, you could introduce LSD into these POWs, and now all of a sudden, maybe as a result of your experiments, you're able to get information out of these POWs that ordinarily you wouldn't get, acting as almost like a truth serum. And this is the very beginning of all these drugs being used against enemies to try to get information from them. This is stuff that later we're going to find to be useful in our own efforts against communists. Okay, but it's all going to come from Germany. This is where it all started. The Nazi doctors in these concentration camps are performing these experiments using LSD on live humans, trying to experiment and see, this is the drug to try to break somebody's mind and turn them into a little automaton where you can get information out of them. You can program them to do what you want, things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. You can hypnotize them into carrying out these acts and then accepting responsibility afterwards and not remembering anybody or anything that caused you to do what you did. This is all about programming the mind. And that's what they're working on with these LSD projects. And this is what we discover. So it's not just gases to kill, gases to shoot at your enemy. It's also these chemicals, these LSD projects to try to program people to do your bidding. And that's what these Nazi doctors are working on. Now, of course, at the same time that you're working on these chemical or biological weapons, you have to be producing vaccines to protect your own people, because chemical and biological weapons, which they call the sword, there's all kinds of cases like in World War I, when the Germans first attempted to use poison gas, they would shoot them across no man's land at the other opposing side's trench, and then the wind would blow the gas back and then they had to realize, oh, we better have gas masks on to protect our own selves, because this gas, it could affect our own people. What if we could protect our own people with a vaccine whereby they are inoculated from any effects from these chemical or biological weapons? Thereby, we can use these weapons and not worry about the consequences. And of course, our enemy won't have those same vaccines, and they'll be the ones affected. And so they call that the shield. So these scientists are working on two things simultaneously. They're working on the sword and the shield. They're working on the weapons, the chemical and biological weapons, but they're also at the same time working on the vaccines to protect their own people. They don't call it that today. Today, it's been in the news a lot about gain of function, right? Dr. Fauci talked about how, we didn't finance or we didn't support any gain of function research with regard to COVID, right? Gain of function would be, in layman's terms, what can be achieved through this virus, and at the same time, what vaccine would protect against this virus. That's all of the research that goes into gain of function research. So whenever you hear gain of function, it means they're looking at the sword and the shield. They're looking at the virus and the vaccine. And we didn't invent that. This came from Germany. The Germans were doing it before anybody. And of course, they had a steady supply of human subjects on whom they could test these swords and shields, these gases and vaccines, on all of these concentration camp victims. So this is what we're discovering. This is their ABC warfare. The Nazis also had the best technology in the world, as we're discovering as we go through these warehouses and these underground caves and all these repositories of weapon systems and gases, et cetera, et cetera. The V1 flying bomb was the world's first cruise missile. It flew about 400 miles an hour, and it go about 160 miles. Excuse me, between June of 44 and March of 45. Now, this is the later stages of the war. The Luftwaffe has pretty much been wiped out. So the Germans have no real ability to defend itself or to offensively attack anyone through the air like it had in the early days of the war, until the V1. And in the V1, which the folks in London called buzz bombs, they made this loud buzzing sound. They launched almost 2,500 of these buzz bombs against London, just trying to inflict maximum damage as they are exiting the war, basically. This V1 flying bomb or buzz bomb would cause a huge blast wave that rippled out from the epicenter, and followed by a giant vacuum, which was followed by a second wave of air rushing in to fill the vacuum. So it had this push and pull effect. It would push out this blast wave and then suck in with the second wave of air rushing. So this is, and of course, it was extreme into the blast center, into the heat, into the fire, into the explosion. So you'd explode out and then suck in. And what the folks in London learned real quick was, you think, oh, I survived the initial blast. And then here comes the sucking part of the second. That was more devastating than the first. So they learned the hard way about this push and pull effect. It was very devastating. That was the V1 flying bomb. The V2 rockets were the most advanced flying weapon ever created during World War II. Now, this is what we discovered, and a lot of these didn't get used, and so we didn't really suffer the full effect of the V2s like we could have, because the war ended too soon for Germany to use all the ones that they had. These things were about 50 feet long. They weighed about 42,000 pounds, and they could carry about 2,000 pounds of explosives, or they could carry a chemical nerve agent. That's the real danger of these V2, because they can fly a little farther, and they fly 5 times the speed of sound. The Allied pilots who try to shoot these things down, they just couldn't. It was like impossible to shoot these things down. So once they were launched, pretty sure they're going to reach their target. They could go about 200 miles, close to 200 miles. The zone of impact from one V2 rocket was about 20 square miles. So the Germans were, as fast as they could, producing these things. It was cheaper to make than planes. You don't have to train a pilot. So they're producing these things. And what we learned later was, though Germany was in full retreat and being squeezed on 2 fronts by the Russians in the east and the Americans, British, and French in the west, and it looked like they were duck soup, they were quietly producing as many of these as possible. They had slave labor from concentration camps. They were producing about 200 of these a day. And the plan was, this was going to save Germany. These V2 rockets, they could mass produce them fast enough and get enough of them on hand. They could start shooting these things off, and that would save Germany from a certain defeat. And it's just interesting. When we find all these, they had enough. They could have done a lot of damage, and a lot of them didn't get shot off. And we'll deal with that later. But it's an interesting question why Hitler did not decide to send more of those V2s off in the desperate days at the end of the war, when it could have at least forestalled maybe the inevitable, but it would have inflicted some serious damage on the Allies. The other thing that the Nazis were involved in, and understand what we're doing today is we're just setting the stage for Operation Paperclip, because we're discovering all this in real time, and we're learning that the Nazis are way ahead of us in their research. They're way ahead of us with their chemical and biological weapons. They're way ahead of us with they're not ahead of us from an atomic standpoint. We caught them. The only reason we did is because one of their own squealed and told us what they were up to. So on the ABC warfare, we beat them to the A, but they've got a lot of B and they've got a lot of C, and their medicine, the research that they've done, and again, because they had these live human subjects, their medicine is way beyond our medicine. The research is so much more accurate, and it's so much more advanced than anybody else's research as far as medicine is concerned. They've been doing research on hypothermia. We're finding all these documents, okay? We're finding all the results of this research, and they've been doing research on hypothermia, and the argument was, well, we need to find out, because our soldiers are fighting in extreme cold conditions in Russia, we need to find out the effects of hypothermia. So we've got all these subjects. We'll test hypothermia. Of course, our pilots are flying at high altitudes, and so there's hypothermia. There's cold temperatures, and and also pressure, air pressure. So we got pilots in extreme altitude. So we need to test, create these altitude chambers, these pressure chambers to test the bodily limits of air pressure on our pilots. And of course, our pilots are flying at extreme speeds, so we need to test the G forces on the human body. Our pilots are getting shot down over the ocean. They're floating around in salt water, and we need to figure out the effects of salt water on the human body and do these desalination experiments to see if the human body can absorb salt water. If so, how much before they go crazy? And they're testing all these things on these live, most of them probably Jews, in these concentration camps. And it was all under the umbrella of Luftwaffe and aviation research. This is to help our pilots who are flying high, flying. This is to test. Uh, it's also for our people in the subs that are, they're down there in the water pressure. You got air pressure. If you fly high, you got low. You got water pressure if you're in a sub deep in the ocean. All of these experiments are justified because, at least in the eyes of the Germans, because they're saying, well, it's going to help our war machine, it's going to help our soldiers, it's going to help our sub captains, it's going to help our pilots, it's going to help our soldiers up in Siberia, and it's going to help our pilots get shot down, land in the ocean, et cetera, et cetera. They're doing experiments on these poor victims about how to treat wounds. For example, they're shivving victims' wounds with wood or glass to cause infections, and then just standing there like a doctor with a clipboard, observing what happens to these people with these wounds. And none of this is done with anesthesia, by the way. That I was watching a documentary on the air pressure, these pressure chambers. They put these. I'll go back and show you a picture here. There he is. This guy's been in a pressure chamber. And what they would do is they'd put him in there and they turn the pressure up. And just about the time at the breaking point, they turn it back down. And the victim would think, oh, I survived. And then they turn it back up a little higher this time. And now your eardrums start to explode, your blood vessels start to explode, and they turn it back down again. And then they turn it back up again, this time even higher. And now your veins, your internal organs, everything starts exploding, and they just keep turning up until nothing left. The victim's just a pile of mush. They've literally exploded the test subject from the inside out, and they were never intended to survive. They were just testing. Okay, if we turn it up to 6, this is what happens. If we turn it up to 7, this is what happens. If we turn it up to 8, this is what happens. If we turn it up to 9, patient dies. Okay, all right, so note that, 9. And we'll bring in somebody else. Now, that guy was 5'10". We'll bring in somebody 6'2". All right, turn up to 6. What's the effect? 7, what's the effect? 8, 9. Oh, he lived till 10. Oh, okay. So body size has something to do with your survival capacity. They would do this, and the desalination experiments. They put people, they force feed seawater, salt water into these subjects, and they just keep doing it over and over and over again. And just day 1, this is the patient exhibited this effect. Day 1, he exhibited that. Day 2, he exhibited this effect. Day 3, day 4, day 4. And it's just incredibly cruel. But of course, it's leading to some really good science because they're testing this on real people. They would, without anesthesia, they'd cut people's legs off, arms off, and amputate victims' limbs, trade them out with other people. I'm going to put his right arm on this guy's right arm. I'm going to put his left leg on his leg. We're just going to trade out legs, and we'll just see what happens. Will his leg assimilate to his leg? Will his bottom part of his leg assimilate to the top part of this other person's leg? And of course, none of it ever worked, but these people died terribly, agonizing deaths. They tested immunizations against diseases. They would infect populations of concentration camps with certain diseases, and they just test different vaccines on them and just see what happened. Sit there and watch them. Antidotes for biological and chemical weapons. You expose these victims to a variety of treatments. This one didn't work. This one did work. And so this is how they were working on the sword, the shield. They give these test subjects the disease or expose them to the chemical or the biological agent, and then start testing all these different treatments that they could call vaccines and use for their people. Pain tolerance became a big test subject. This was something that the Third Reich was interested in, because they thought, well, POWs, if our guys get taken as prisoners of war, what is the pain tolerance of our soldiers before they start giving up information? Because we know they're going to get tortured, especially if Stalin takes them. So is there a way to immunize our guys from giving up important information? In other words, is there something that we can teach them or train them or give them that'll help resist pain so that they don't give up information that's important to us? On the flip side, is there something that we can do to the POWs that we capture? There's some pain that we can induce that will give us the information that we want from them. Again, the sword and the shield. And I just hesitate to get too specific, but I mean, like with some of these men, I won't even get into what they did to women, but with men, they would take a man and nail his testicles to the tabletop. And as he was fainting, because he was obviously blacking out, they'd throw cold water in his face to try to keep him conscious. There were 100 different ways. They had a little test that they would kind of like a Chinese water torture test, where they'd sit a guy against a wall and they'd have a little mechanical hammer that would lightly touch the top of the person's head. And of course, the guy was bound, he couldn't move. And this little hammer would just barely touch him, very gently, but it just kept doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it over and over and over again. And of course, what happens is it messes with your mind. And in your mind, you start focusing on it and you feel like it's hitting you harder and harder and faster and faster. It's not, but you feel like it is. And to get away from that, which you can't move, you can't get away, they would bash their heads against block walls, which they were tied up against, and literally bash their own brains out against that wall. And there's a doctor standing there with a clipboard, noting the time, how long it took. This is part of the pain tolerance. We could use this. This would be really useful against POWs to get information. We do this long enough, and it says here they die. They kill themselves. They bash their own brains out against this wall after 8 hours. So we can do this for 7 hours and then take them into a room and promise not to do it anymore if they'll give us the information. And most likely they will, to avoid that little hammer. I could go on and on. There were so many different tests. Here's a few pictures. It didn't matter if they were kids. You can see here in the bottom picture in the middle, these are shock treatments. Okay. And all of this, by the way, is later going to make it into mainstream medicine here in the United States. The lobotomy, the shock treatments came from Nazi Germany. A lot of the Nazi medicine, and you'll see why when we get into Operation Paperclip. I'm just kind of giving the backstory right now. These guys and the science and the medicine that they sort of come up with during this period of time when they have this steady stream of test subjects to use, victims to, it's so advanced that after the war, there's going to be a rush by us and the Soviets to get as many of these Nazi doctors back home to our country so that they can teach our doctors the medicine that they've learned through these experiments. In other words, come teach us what you've learned, what you've documented, all the experiments that you did. Come teach it to us. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Some of these pictures, you can see they're not above using children. And top right, this is a hypothermia chamber. They put them in a vat, a tub of cold water, and watch their body and just watch the temperature gauge go down, 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 down as the body slowly shut down and froze to death, right? And sitting there, you can see the Nazi doctors are sitting there and they're observing them and they're looking at the time and they're watching the test subject to see how his body responds, checking his vitals and probably his eyes and his ears and all his senses, trying to learn about sensory deprivation and all this kind of stuff. They're learning on these real live people. The bottom right is a picture of these wounds that they inflict on without anesthesia, trying to see how long it takes before infection sets in, inflict these massive cuts, and probably insert into those cuts some kind of terrible, maybe a disease or some kind of an agent that they know is going to cause a terrible infection, and then they just sit back and observe it. It's just diabolical, the stuff that these Nazi doctors were involved in. And that's what I really want to do. I want to paint a picture of what these people are and what they're doing, so that when we get into what comes next, I hope it explains why it was so wrong what we did to bring these people to America. These guys should have been at Nuremberg. They're war criminals for what they did. But instead, they get treated like mini celebrities and brought back to America to teach us everything that they know. It's just awful stuff. Mass sterilization. And we talked about this in the depopulation miniseries and how of course, the Germans, most people associate the idea of a superior race and an inferior race with the Germans. They learned it from us. Go back and watch that series, and I went into it pretty in depth about how this all started in America, this eugenics movement. But the Germans took it to a whole new level. And so what they're trying to figure out is how to limit the birth rates of inferior races. One of the reasons why Dr. Mengele was so fascinated with twins. Again, the sword and the shield. How can we keep the inferior races from propagating their species? In other words, we'll give them mass sterilization. But at the same time, what is it that causes twins to be born? Because we would like the superior race to have more babies. So if I could somehow find the genome or whatever it is, the key to unlock twins and triplets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we could apply that to the Germans, to the Aryans, so that they're having, instead of one baby at a time, they're having 2 babies, 3 babies, 4 babies at a time, whatever, so that their race is exploding in size and in numbers, whereas at the same time, we're mass sterilizing all the inferior races so that they're becoming extinct. And of course, this all comes from social Darwinism and eugenics, the idea we're going to euthanize or kill off the mentally and physically disabled people, and we're going to promote the expansion of the superior races. We're going to call it survival of the fittest, even though we're artificially doing all this. We're choosing who the winners and the losers are, and we're trying to kill off the losers and reproduce the winners at a faster rate. And a lot of that came through breeding. They also utilized something that was in the news I just saw yesterday. China is involved in this today as we speak. Live organ harvesting. The Germans started this, creating an organ bank from non-Aryans for Aryan purposes. So, if your soldiers are getting wounded in war and they need a transplant, they need this, there's a steady supply from these non-Aryans, these inferior races that we've taken from them. We needed so many livers, we needed so many pairs of lungs, we needed so many hearts, we needed on and on. And so we've just harvested these organs from these non-Aryans, these inferior races. They're just here to die anyway. And so that at least they're serving some useful purpose for the Aryans. And this is what the Germans are doing. Anyway, we're discovering all this as we go into Germany after the war is over, after they've surrendered. So here is basically a synopsis of what we've discovered. We've discovered that they have an atomic program. Now, they're not ahead of the Americans, thankfully. One of their own came to America, and American ingenuity and resources, and that was a big part of it. We had resources, past the Germans so as to become the first nation to have the atomic bomb. But the Germans were working on it. And as far as biological and chemical are concerned, the Germans had an ample supply of adult pigs upon which they could experiment. Thus, their research biologically was the best in the world, which means their biological weapons were way better, were way far advanced than anybody else had access to in the world. Same thing with chemical. They had two gases, which they themselves invented, tabun and sarin, the deadliest nerve agents in the world at that time, and they both came from Germany. And their LSD experiments were groundbreaking. We're going to be very fascinated by their LSD experiments and the idea that you could program people through LSD and hypnosis to do what you want them to do, have no memory of it afterwards, to actually be like automatons. They're programmed robots to carry out an act, an assassination, a covert operate, whatever, and then have no memory of it afterwards and take full responsibility for it. And boy, if you could get that kind of technology, if you could get that capability, think of the possibilities. And so this is going to be really interesting to the United States, these LSD experiments. And of course, from a technology standpoint, they're way further down the road than the rest of us. They have we already learned about the V1 rockets. The poor British are experiencing the brunt end of the V1 rockets, these buzz bombs. But then we find in these big warehouses huge supplies of these V2 rockets, which are 20 years ahead of the rest of the world's technology. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we brought some of these rocket scientists to America. You know, when we get into the 60s, we can't, or late 50s into the early 60s, we can't even get rockets off the launch pad. You know, with our space program, they go up a few feet, turn around, come back down, explode in midair, veer off in some crazy. We couldn't. We were so far behind in rocket technology, and it's one of the reasons why the Germans and these Nazi rocket scientists become basically the origins of our NASA program. NASA, if it weren't for the German rocket scientists, NASA doesn't exist. The putting the man on the moon wouldn't even have been possible. It all came from Germany and German technology. And of course, all of this is made possible because, the production of these rockets, for example, it's all made possible because they have all this unlimited supply of labor, these concentration camps. And they just work these people to death, building these rockets. And same thing with the biological weapons, the chemical weapons, and the medicine. The concentration camps, they went a step further than anyone else had ever gone before, or maybe anyone else was willing to go. And that was to use live human beings to test biological agents on, to test chemical weapons on, to test vaccines against these biological agents and chemical weapons on, to test all these different medical research. As controversial as we just discussed, all of these different medical, and I hesitate to call it medical research, but that's what they called it. And they have all these live human beings upon whom they can test do these experiments on. And so that is why the Nazi medical research is still cited today. To this day, their research was superior to anything else going on in Britain or France or the United States or Russia, because they were doing it on live human beings. And so this is what we're discovering about the Germans as we go into Germany after the war. Now, the question is, if Hitler was bent on world conquest, like we've always been told, why didn't he use all of the ABC weapons available to him? He didn't have the atomic weapons yet, but he had the biological weapons. He had the chemical weapons. He had the V2 rockets that he could use as delivery agents for the biological and chemical. Why didn't he? We found stockpiles of these V2 rockets with warheads that had the chemical nerve agent in them, but they were still stockpiled. Hitler never used them. So the question is, they went to such lengths to create this ABC weapon program, and they had all of these physicists and these scientists and these medical doctors, and they're all working on this ABC weapon program, and it's far advanced. Anything else the world has to counteract it with respect to the biological and chemical, not the atomic, because again, the Americans had atomic, but they had passed everybody else with all this other stuff. Why didn't they use it? They had the rocket technology. They had the people to continue to make the rockets because they had all this unlimited supply of labor from the concentration camp. Why didn't they use it? Well, there's, obviously we can't ask Hitler why, but there is some speculation. Historians have said, well, first of all, they didn't use atomic weapons because they failed to develop atomic weapons in time to use in World War II, and that's true. Okay, the atomic weapons never materialized in time for them to use them. Second, speculation is that Hitler refused to use biological and or chemical weapons because he had a phobia about germs. And he himself had been subject to a gas attack in World War I. It's how he ended up injured and in a hospital bed when World War I ended. He was temporarily blinded by a poison gas attack that was initiated by his side. It blew back at him, and it so affected him that he was hesitant to use biological and or chemical weapons himself against other people. He'd suffered at the hands of a chemical gas attack himself. And third, the Germans' chemical nerve agents became so deadly that masks were rendered useless. So the science got ahead, the sword got ahead of the shield. They didn't have the vaccine to protect their own population, and the masks, which was a stopgap measure to protect if you didn't have the vaccine, were useless against these nerve agents. They got so potent. And so these are speculations, okay? The first one is they didn't have atomic weapons. But as far as the biological and chemical weapons, the fact that Hitler might have been spooked because he himself had been victim of a gas attack in World War I, or that he was nervous about using it because it was so potent. They didn't have a vaccine. They didn't have the gas mask was useless. And so they had the sword, but they didn't have the shield. So it leads me to believe, and this is speculation, is that if the war had lasted another year, maybe 2 years, possibly they would have used them. Because by that time, maybe the vaccines would have caught up. Maybe the shield, part of the weaponry, had caught up. Now the Germans, the Aryans, a superior race, would be immune to the effects of all these potent chemical nerve agents, and they would have a huge supply of V2 rockets to start shooting these things off at all their enemies and not have to worry about them affecting themselves or their own people. So it's some pretty scary stuff that we're discovering. And what we're learning as a result of this is that Germany has some pretty smart people. Germany has, we learned yesterday that Dulles and James Angleton considered some of these German SS officers, some of these German generals to be such high value targets because of their intelligence value that they were worth saving and bringing home to America so we could use them in our struggle against the communists. Well, we are discovering the same thing now as we go through Germany with a fine-tooth comb about their doctors, about their scientists, about their rocket scientists, their all these people involved in building these biological weapons, these chemical nerve agents, these rockets. these vaccines, their technology. We're learning there are some really smart people that if we could save them, even though they're war criminals, and you'll see as we get into it, I'll be specific with some of these people that we brought to America, what they did during the war and why they would be considered prime candidates for Nuremberg. But because we valued their skill and their expertise, we saved them. We plucked them out of their destiny, which was Nuremberg, and brought them back to America and utilized them to our benefit instead. This is where we get, I'll explain Operation Paperclip and the whole thing. But I wanted to just set the table today, the backstory for what these folks were involved in and why all of their efforts were so successful. Primarily because they were doing these diabolical things against live human subjects. And that in itself is a war crime. If nothing else, that in itself is a war crime. All the other stuff is just gravy. So that is going to be the backstory to Operation Paperclip. We now realize that we have in our possession documents and people and research that can give us a leg up in the Cold War against the Soviets, that can give us some of the same technical wherewithal, etc. All this stuff that the Germans had, all these advantages that the Germans have, we can now have because we've got their people, and we've got the documents, and we've got the science. Now it's right there for us to have. The only objection to this is that these people are supposed to be tried at Nuremberg for war crimes. But if you have an ultra vires mindset and you see any benefit at all in keeping these people and saving them from that fate and bringing them to America and utilizing them in the CIA and NASA and American medicine and all these different things, if you see any benefit at all, it doesn't matter what the public interest is. It doesn't matter what the moral implications are. It doesn't matter what the ethical consideration. It doesn't matter what's right or wrong. It doesn't matter. What matters is the benefit that they provide. And we'll immunize ourselves by making this a top secret program, classifying it so no one will know. And when they do find out, it'll be years too late for anything to ever happen to anybody who was involved in this. And we'll get away with it. So that is the backstory to Operation Paperclip. It's really twofold. It's Operation Sunrise, where Alan Dulles starts this whole idea, and he violates the orders. He literally is insubordinate to his commander-in-chief, FDR, and he violates the terms of Casablanca, and he starts hiding away and creating these rat lines to save these German generals who have intelligence information and have intelligence skills and they have enough value as intelligence assets to help the U.S. intelligence apparatus going forward. So he makes his own policy. And all of a sudden, you start seeing that spread like gangrene to other parts of the United States government. When we go into Germany, and instead of following through on Casablanca and the idea that we're going to hold all these war criminals, we're going to bring them to account for all their war crimes, we start making all these exceptions for people who we consider to be valuable and people that we consider to be important to our cause going forward, which is winning the Cold War against the Soviets. So that's the backstory. Tomorrow, episode 120, I think today's 119. So 120, we'll start looking at Operation Paperclip specifically and all these different people that we snuck out of Germany and brought home to the United States because they knew something about rocket technology, or they knew something about LSD experiments, or they knew something about medicine that we didn't know, or biological weapons, or chemical weapons, or atomic weapons, whatever. We'll get specific with some names. All right, so that's episode 119. Feel free to check out my website, www.sphistory.com. If you want to check out any other resources, also feel free to subscribe to this channel on YouTube. It's free. Feel free to share. Feel free to, I have Rumble, and I'll post it in the comment section, my Rumble link, also my Spotify link, and also my Twitter link. If for any reason this disappears from YouTube, you know how that works. Also, feel free to leave a comment. Feel free to give me a thumbs up, hit the notification bell, and I will be offering in this near-term future another mini course on the JFK assassination. So if you're interested in that, you might shoot me a comment in the on the YouTube channel about what topic would be interesting to you for me to cover in one of these mini courses. I'm open to suggestion. Otherwise, I'm just going to go chronologically from beginning to end. But if there is a specific topic that you're interested in, feel free to let me know. And I will try to accommodate that. Okay? Hope everybody has a great day, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.